After slavery was prohibited in 1865, formerly enslaved people in America were granted full citizenship, the right to vote, and under the 14th Amendment, protection from racial violence. Formerly enslaved people were promised land and opportunity, but most got nothing because America quickly devolved into an era of racial terrorism and oppression for black citizens. White people in the South were angry that people formerly considered property were now equal citizens. Many turned to violence. In the years immediately following the Civil War, thousands of black people were murdered when they tried to claim their rights. Soon afterwards, federal troops were withdrawn from the South, ending a brief period of racial progress known as Reconstruction. Nationwide resistance to racial equality resulted in the reestablishment of racial subordination through biased laws, disenfranchisement, and terrorism, most dramatically enforced through lynchings. Racial terror lynchings of black people defined a shameful era in America. These lynchings differed from the hanging of white people in places where there was no functioning criminal justice system. Racial terror lynchings were directed at all black people. They enforced compliance with racial hierarchy and white supremacy, and ensured racial segregation and denial of equal rights. In 1916, in Cedar Bluff, Mississippi, a young black man named Jeff Brown accidentally bumped into a white woman while running to catch a train. A white mob stopped him and lynched him, beating him and then hanging him from a tree for his insolence and carelessness. His public murder was not about criminal punishment, but was instead about maintaining racial hierarchy and terrorizing the black community. White town residents proudly sold photographs of Mr. Brown's brutalized body hanging from the tree for 5 cents each. The Equal Justice Initiative has documented thousands of racial terror lynchings between 1877 and 1950. EJI has confirmed the lynchings of over 4,000 black people who were tortured, maimed, beaten, shot, hung, and burned alive by crowds of white people, often with the cooperation of law enforcement or government officials. The terror of lynching was so widespread that millions of black people fled the South and settled in the urban North and West as refugees of American terror, shaping the current demographic geography of the United States. On July 5, 1933, an older black woman named Elizabeth Lawrence reprimanded a group of white children who threw rocks at her as she walked home from work. Word spread that a black woman had dared to rebuke white children, and that night, an angry mob of white citizens lynched Ms. Lawrence for her audacity. Her home was then burned to the ground. Her son, Alexander, fled to Boston. Racial terror lynchings often had the atmosphere of carnivals, with food vendors and souvenir stands. Hundreds or thousands of white people would often gather to watch and take part in the torture and murder of black citizens. There has been no effort in America to confront this legacy of racial terror. While hundreds of Confederate monuments litter the landscape in southern states, there has been no public recognition of the violence endured by black people. On October 7, 1910, a white mob in Montgomery, Alabama tried to abduct and lynch black men being held in jail on suspicion of miscegenation, or interracial sexual relations. When they were unable to get the men out of the jail, the frustrated mob lynched a black taxi driver named John Dell, who was sitting in his cab nearby. No one was ever arrested or prosecuted for his murder. EJI's Community Remembrance Project collects soil from the many sites where terror lynchings occurred. Jars labeled with the names of murdered black citizens are on public display at EJI, a powerful visual reminder of history we must face. EJI is working to create a permanent memorial to honor victims of lynching, a place to reflect on America's history of racial violence. We hope to place historical markers at hundreds of lynching sites around the country. Contemporary issues like police violence, excessive punishment in the criminal justice system, and even harsh and punitive treatment of children of color in schools and on streets cannot be understood without a deeper examination into our history of racial violence. More truthful discourse and reflection on our history of racial injustice is essential for us to achieve racial equity. Confronting the legacy of lynching is critical to advancing this conversation. We hope you will join our effort to help towns, cities, and states confront and recover from these tragic histories of racial violence through truth and reconciliation, where there can truly be equal justice for all.